Good morning, everyone. My name is Dimer Esigba from BSEd English 1A. So for today's video, I am going to discuss the Week 7 module in Linguistics 2. So without further ado, let's get started. Discuss the outstanding contributions of the following in linguistics. First, we have Aristotle's. Aristotle's contributions to the history of the philosophy of language is foundational. On interpretations, Aristotle settled the questions raised by Plato over the naturalness of meaning by declaring that linguistics meaning is conventional. He set out the so-called semantic triad, setting out the relations between linguistic utterances and written words, cognition and extramental reality. He identified the basic components of sentences, the name and verb or subject and predicate. A recurrent topic of interest of Aristotle is linguistic ambiguity, which he takes up in categories, topics and sophistical reputations. The distinctions between linguistics and real definitions is set out in the excerpt from Posterior Analytics. Finally, Aristotle expands the discussions of language into its poetical and rhetorical dimensions in the excerpts from Poetics and Rhetorics. In the context of his theory of truth as correspondence, he also provided the first semantic analysis of prepositions in that he distinguished two main constituents, the predicates which expresses a property, and the remainder of the prepositions referring to a substance to which the property is assigned. Next is Robert Loth. His short Introductions to English Grammar 1762 became a standard textbook, and his name has become synonymous with prescriptive grammar. Loth's reputation as a prescriptivist is not entirely deserved, though he liberally illustrated his grammar rules with errors to be found in the English Bible and standard authors. His approach to correctness was not invariably rigid, and like most grammarians, he describes English as well as prescribing its rules. While Loth advised against ending sentences with prepositions, he acknowledged that constructions as an idiom is strongly inclined to. Loth also distinguished between shall and will as the future auxiliary. Yet he noted that the pattern is a new one that took hold in the language after the vulgar translations of the Bible. Loth was convinced that English is rule-governed, and he defended the regularity and simplicity of the language against a traditions which viewed it as too primitive to possess any grammar at all. His model was Latin grammar, but he readily modified this to accommodate the idiosyncrasies of English. He also championed English language study in school, arguing that it facilitated the acquisitions of the classics as well as the concepts of universal grammar. Next is Sir William Jones. Is best known for his famous Third Discourse of 1786, in which he proposed that Sanskrit's affinity to Greek and Latin could be explained by possessing a common, earlier source, one known today as Indo-European. This brilliant thesis of language families laid the groundwork for modern comparative linguistics. Jones' interest and achievements, however, range far beyond language. Next is Ferdinand de Saussure, introduced a structuralism in linguistics, marking a revolutionary break in the study of language, which had till then been historical and philological. In his course in General Linguistics 1916, Saussure saw language as a system of sign constructed by convention, understanding meaning to be relational, being produced by the interaction between various signifiers and signified. He held that meaning cannot be understood in isolation. Saussure illustrated this relationality of language with the term's paradigmatic axis of selections and the syntagmatic axis of combinations. Further, he challenged the view of reality as independent and existing outside language and reduced tongue gauge to a mere naming system. He questions the conventional correspondence theory of meaning and argued that meaning is arbitrary and that language does not merely reflect the world but constitutes it. Explain the historical development of language, evolutionary or Darwinian. Darwin eventually published his views on language in Descent of Man, 1871, as part of a chapter on the comparative mental powers of humans and the lower animals. He acknowledged that language had justly been considered as one of the chief distinctions between man and the lower animals. But he went on to emphasize the similarities between animal and human communications. Darwin's arguments were based on his broad knowledge of anthropology, language use and acquisition in children, linguistic pathologies, and the behavior of a wide range of animals, wild and domestic. Much of this information had been gathered through correspondence as well as observations of his own children and pets. Darwin described how language might have evolved through natural and sexual selection. He compared birds learning to sing to infants babbling. An early progenitor or man of man, he wrote, probably used his voice as did the male gibbon to produce musical cadences for courtships and to compete with other males. The origins of language as a system of signifiers, he added, might have evolved from the imitations of the sounds of various predators, growls and snarls for example, which functions as warning signs. Darwin addressed the natural theology of Max Muller and others by arguing that language use, while requiring a certain mental capacity, would also stimulate brain development, enabling long trains of thought and strengthening reason's power. Vocalization in humans would be greatly enhanced by the development of other functions, especially the use of the hands. Finally, Darwin drew an extended analogy between the evolution of languages and species, noting in each domain the presence of rudiments, of cruising and blending and of variations, and remarking on how each developed gradually through a process of struggle, the survival of certain favored words in the struggle for existence is the natural selections. Define, describe, or explain the following. The Romance languages are a group of related language, all derived from Vulgar Latin within historical times and forming a subgroup of the Italic branch of the Indo-European language family. The major languages of the family include French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Proto-Germanic, the prehistoric unrecorded language that was the ancestors of all Germanic languages. The Proto-Germanic language is not directly attested by any coherent surviving text. It has been reconstructed using the comparative method. The Indo-European language are a language family native to the overwhelming majority of Europe, the Iranian plateau, and the northern Indian subcontinent. Some European languages of this family, such as English, French, Portuguese, Russian, Dutch, and Spanish, have expanded through colonialisms in the modern period and are now spoken across several continents. Sino-Tibetan languages, group of languages that includes both the Chinese and the Tibeto-Burman languages. In terms of numbers of speakers, they constitute the world's second largest language family, after Indo-European, including more than 300 languages and major dialects. Explain the following. Graham's laws defines the relationships between certain stop consonants in Germanic language and their originals in Indo-European. These consonants underwent shift that changed the way they are pronounced. This law is also known as the Germanic consonant shift, first consonant shift, first Germanic sound shift, and Rast rule. It is important for historical linguistics because it clearly demonstrates the principle that sounds change is a regular phenomenon and not a random process affecting only some words, as had been taught previously. Next is the Great Vowel Shift, was a series of changes in the pronunciation of the English language that took place primarily between 1400 and 1700, beginning in southern England and today having influenced effectively all dialects of English. Through this vowel shift, the pronunciations of all Middle English long vowels was changed. Some consonant sounds changed as well, particularly those that became silent. The term great vowel shift is sometimes used to include these consonant changes. Discuss the history of English language. First is Old English language, also called Anglo-Saxon. Language spoken and written in England before 1100. It is the ancestor of Middle English and Modern English. Scholars place Old English in the Anglo-Frisian group of West Germanic languages. In contrast to Modern English, Old English had three genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. In the noun and adjectives and nouns, pronouns and adjectives were inflected for case. Noun and adjective paradigms contain four cases: nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. While pronouns also had forms for the instrumental case, Old English had a greater proportion of strong verbs, sometimes called irregular verbs, in contemporary grammars than does Modern English. Next is Middle English language. The vernacular spoken and written in England from about 1100 to about 1500, the descendant of the Old English language and the ancestor of Modern English. Modern English is conventionally defined as the English language since about 1450 or 1500. Distinctions are commonly drawn between the early modern period, roughly 1450 to 1800, and late modern English 1800 to the present. The most recent stage in the evolutions of the language is commonly called present-day English. However, as Diane Davis notes, linguists argue for a further stage in the language, beginning around 1945 and Cold World English, reflecting the globalization of English as an international lingua franca. In the early modern English period, 1500 to 1700, steps were taken towards Standard English. And this was also the time when Shakespeare wrote, but these perspectives are only part of the bigger picture. This chapter looks at early modern English as a variable and changing language not unlike English today. Standardization is found particularly in spelling, and new vocabulary was created as a result of the spread of English into various professional and occupational specializations. New research using digital corpora, dictionaries, and databases reveals the gradual nature of these processes. Ongoing developments were no less gradual in pronunciation, with processes such as the Great Vowel Shift or in grammar, where many changes resulted in new means of expressions and greater transparency. Word order was also subject to gradual change, becoming more fixed over time. Next is the late modern period. is the first in the history of English for which an unprecedented wealth of textual material exists. Using increasingly sophisticated databases, the contributions in this volume explore grammatical usage from the period, specifically morphological and syntactic change in a broad context. Some chapters explore the socio-historical background of the period while others provide information on prescriptivism, newspaper language, language contact, and regional variation in British and American English. Internal processes of change are discussed against grammaticalizations, theory, and construction grammar, and the rich body of textual evidence is used to draw inferences on the precise nature of historical change, exposing readers to a wealth of data that informs the descriptions of a broad range of syntactic phenomena. This book is ideal for graduate students and researchers interested in historical linguistics, corpus linguistics, and language development. And that would be all. Thank you, and thank you for listening, and have a nice day.